5 words hastily scribbled by a child saved the life of one of New York's most powerful men. Amidst the luxury, the glare of cameras, and a multi-million-dollar event, a note written with trembling hands revealed a secret so dark it could turn a night of celebration into an unprecedented tragedy. What did the son of a simple maid know that even the most highly trained security guards failed to spot? And how far can betrayal go when it originates within the family? Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us bring you more moving stories like this that transform and inspire lives. Ken Griffin watched Manhattan through the panoramic glass on the top floor, where the lights flickered on like obedient constellations and the wind licked the building's cold skin. On the walnut table were lined invitations to the Avalon Museum of Art Gala, the folded speech, an old pen holder from his military grandfather, and a glass of water sweating perfect rings. The apartment smelled of leather, old books, and polished metal, as if the order could drive away any shadow that tried to enter. His shoes were propped an inch into the Persian rug, his tie was still loose, and the clock was silently counting down to his departure time. The phone sat on silent, surrounded by reports that spoke of markets, mergers, and metrics as predictable as a metronome. Behind the predictability vibrated an invisible thread of unease, a formless premonition that found no place in the logic trained over decades. The portrait of the grandfather, in a darkened wooden frame, reflected firm eyes that seemed to ask for posture, strategy, presence on the greater chessboard of life. Ken held up the speech and read it softly, testing the cadence he intended to deliver to the Avalon's white marble ballroom, where promises of education and art would echo. The words sounded right, but a little far from what the silence of the apartment insisted on whispering. He had prepared everything with discipline. Armored car, secondary route, team positioned, and Marcus Chun had reviewed protocols that rarely failed. Still, the heart kept a rhythm that was a little out of time, like a drum that misses the beat by an almost imperceptible thousandth. The city below breathed traffic, sirens, and laughter, and he tried to synchronize his breathing with this living mass that always reminded him of where he had come from and what it had cost to get there. The curtain moved a little, cut by a draft that brought with it the damp smell of a sky about to rain. Ken considered texting Victoria Griffin to confirm the location of the family's guests, but left the phone where it was. Some invisible piece was brushing against the board, and although he didn't know it yet, there was already a child's hand approaching the edge of the table where destiny awaited. The doorbell rang without urgency, followed by the controlled sound of the door opening, and Abigail Hayes entered with measured steps, her uniform impeccable, her eyes avoiding shining more than necessary. Behind her came Dylan Brooks, 13, black, worn backpack held by a patched strap, sneakers that knew the topography of the hallways better than many security guards. The air seemed to change density when the boy stopped 3 steps away from Ken, took a deep breath, and fixed his gaze for a second on that portrait of his grandfather who commanded the room even when silent. Abigail pretended to adjust the tray of clean glasses to justify her presence, but her fingers betrayed a microscopic tension that no amount of training and discretion could hide. Dylan took a half step forward, his backpack scraping against the zipper with a short sound, and held out his closed hand, as if giving away a secret that burns the skin. Ken noticed the subtle tremor, a wave-like pattern that ran from his wrist to the crumpled paper, and gently lifted his own hand, as if bringing one bridge closer to another. The note had the roughness of improvisation and the weight of the irrefutable, folded twice, without a cinder, without ornament, just the urgency of existing. In the background, the clock in the hallway announced 1 more minute, and the city, indifferent, lit up another row of windows, multiplying lives that were unaware of that meeting. Abigail bit the inside of her cheek and adjusted an invisible strand of hair, aware that any word could unravel the thread that still held the world together. Ken opened the paper with surgeon's precision, preparing for numbers, addresses, some logistical note that would complete the evening's script. 5 words leaped out like short, cold blades, simple enough to fit in any pocket, violent enough to change maps and timetables. Don't panic. It's a trap, drawn in tense handwriting, lines that hesitated and resumed, like footsteps in a dark corridor. The leather of the chair creaked as he leaned back an inch, not out of theatrics, but out of the instinct of someone who had just heard a creak in the wood from downstairs. Dylan held his hand suspended for a moment, unsure whether to withdraw or anchor, and then lowered his arm, waiting for a signal that there was still ground. Somewhere between the window and the portrait, something ancient awoke, and the night that seemed so planned took on the contours of an enigma that was not part of the discourse. Ken's first impulse was to get Marcus Chun on the phone, line up variables, fold perimeters, turn words into perimeters and perimeters into silence. The second was older, remembering his grandfather, the whispered advice about enemies who prefer access keys to broken doors, and breathing until his mind saw the whole board again. He glanced at Dylan and found true fear, a fear that doesn't know how to act, and therefore leaks truth through its pores, something that risk reports never measure. Abigail placed the tray on the counter carefully, as if the metal might wake some sleeping creature, and excused herself in a thin voice that barely carried. Ken folded the ticket back, now not as if he were keeping a piece of paper, but as if he were putting a small, absolute probability detonator in his pocket. The phrase repeated itself soundlessly in my head, each time with a new emphasis, as if the comma were changing places and constructing secret meanings where there were none. The protocol said gala, speech, photos, smiles, but an open crack invited one to imagine parallel corridors, polished silver that reflects more than utensils, looks that do not appear on cameras. He felt the weight of the name Victoria Griffin as a neutral object, and yet his brain registered that weight, just as it had registered Nathan at the bar in memories of other nights. The question wasn't just what trap, but who needs me not to recognize it as a trap? And that slight shift changed the geometry of the room. He told himself not to get into the choreography of panic, to let discipline take the place of haste, because haste is usually the favorite music of those who plan something. The clock ticked forward another minute, enough for a decision to grow whole. No canceling, no noisy improvisation, just new eyes behind the same public face. An old name appeared on the edge of my mind. Ethan Cole, not as nostalgia, but as a tool kept at the bottom of the box, cold, reliable, made for nights like these. Ken walked to the window and looked back at the city with a different look, like someone testing a mirror in a different light, and noticed that his own breathing had changed in depth. When he turned around, Dylan was still there, and in that detail there was a clue. Anyone who uses a child to deliver a warning is counting on the wrong reflex of the person receiving the warning. He put the paper in his inside jacket pocket and nodded silently, as the gala would continue, but some people would notice that, without changing a single smile, something essential had already been turned aside. The armored car glided through the avenues like a capsule of silence, crossing the nervous pulse of the city as it prepared for the night. The lights reflected off the glass like artificial constellations as Ken Griffin adjusted his tie in the side mirror, feeling the fabric like a rope holding him to a pre-programmed image. On the dashboard, the digital clock flashed the minutes in phosphorescent green, bringing him inexorably closer to the Avalon Museum of Art Gala. The drivers in front maintained a watchful posture, eyes unmoving but hands steady on the steering wheel, while Marcus Chin spoke softly into his headset, giving invisible instructions. The atmosphere inside the vehicle was heavy, not because of the silence, but because of the air of anticipation that precedes a show whose script no one dares reveal in full. Ken took a deep breath, feeling the note in his inner jacket pocket as if it were made of heated metal, reminding him every second that nothing about that night would be ordinary. He tried to focus on the doubled speech beside him, rehearsed phrases that now sounded fragile compared to those 5 words written by Dylan Brooks. The mind trained in negotiations and calculations evaluated every likely face in the room, every smile that might hide razors. The glass reflected not only the city, but the hardened gaze he himself avoided recognizing, a reflection that reminded him of his grandfather in times of war. His heart raced in short waves, without giving in to panic, but also without obeying the regular rhythm that the billionaire knew so well. The driver announced that there were only a few minutes left, and Ken noticed that the entire city seemed to be shortened into streets that converged on a single destination. On the other side of the window, people walked obliviously, their laughter and footsteps indifferent to what was happening beneath that elegant night. The car took a gentle turn, and for the first time, Ken felt that the routine, once his shield, was now the mask the enemy was most waiting for. The weight of the decision to maintain the event was not only strategic, it was also an act of disdain against those who believed they could dictate its movement. But even in this gesture of resistance, an ancient chill began to seep through the inner walls of his mind, as if there were already too many eyes waiting in destiny. Inside the museum, the main hall was ready like a magazine photograph. White columns rose to the glass ceiling, where light reflected in golden arches, and marble sculptures seemed to silently watch over the still arriving guests. The red carpet snaked between circular tables, covered with glasses lined up like crystal armies, reflecting the glow of the central chandeliers. The air carried the scent of rare flowers mixed with the discreet aroma of champagne already served in the most discreet corners. Marcus Chun positioned his men among waiters, photographers, and receptionists, with glances that went unnoticed by the distracted, but recorded every out-of-step gesture. Ken walked down the center aisle, smiling as always, but feeling his stomach tighten at the contrast between the exuberant luxury and the note tucked into his jacket. Victoria Griffin was already there, surrounded by admirers, her blue dress reflecting the light like the surface of a nocturnal lake. Beside him, Adrian Cross was talking in an enthusiastic tone, gesturing with hands that hid a nervous energy, always greater than the politeness of his words. Nathan Griffin, further away, occupied his usual spot, leaning against the counter, his glass of whiskey half empty, his expression a mixture of mockery and resentment. Ken watched them like pieces on a board that changed before his eyes, and with each smile he received an echo of the note. It's a trap. The speech he had prepared now seemed like a prop, a veil covering something much darker than the glare of the cameras. Journalists jostled for space, flashbulbs exploded, and everything went on as usual, but Ethan Cole's trained gaze, invisible among the guests, was already probing the cracks. Ken knew the night had turned into a double cross, and the audience had no idea of the plot unfolding behind the speakers. He calmly raised his glass of water, pretending to participate, but his eyes swept every corner of the room, as if reading a code hidden in the shadows. And amidst the rehearsed laughter of those present, something began to move in the underground of that night, announcing that the note was not just a warning, but a prelude. Ken's heart raced almost imperceptibly as a waiter approached with a practiced gesture. The tray reflected the gold of the chandeliers, and among the glasses, one stood out for the slight tremor of the liquid, as if it carried a secret. The man smiled, but his eyes didn't follow the gesture, revealing a shadow of anxiety that didn't belong in the scene. Ken reached out, calculating the movement, but when he looked up, he caught a distant detail. Ethan Cole, motionless next to a sculpture, moving his head in a subtle gesture of denial. For an instant, the entire room seemed to freeze, and the glass inches from his hand became the center of a deadly dilemma. Ken stepped back naturally, smiling at the camera that captured his expression and refused the cup under the excuse of needing to maintain clarity for the speech. The waiter lowered his eyes slightly, but the look of disappointment was too quick to go unnoticed. Ken's heart was beating like a muffled drum, while Marcus, at the back of the room, was already discreetly signaling two men to follow the employee. The music filled the space again, and the guests' chatter resumed its usual rhythm, unaware of the thread that had just been cut. Ken straightened his jacket, feeling the note like iron against his chest, and realized that the game was progressing silently, every movement disguised as part of the party. His mind worked in circles, remembering his grandfather's saying, "The most dangerous enemy is the one who smiles before drawing the blade." He looked around and saw Victoria waving, Nathan drinking, Adrian smiling, but none of them seemed to escape the shadow that grew in the back of his thoughts. The threat was already inside, dancing amidst laughter and applause, invisible to anyone who didn't know how to look. Ken took a deep breath and stood straight, knowing that every gesture would be watched not only by the guests, but by eyes hidden behind the curtain of the scene. And as the night wore on, the feeling that something bigger was brewing began to gain the density of a thunderclap about to break the sky. The string quartet's soft notes echoed through the hall, as if they were the perfect backdrop for a night of celebration. But to Ken Griffin, each chord seemed to carry a hidden tension. The Avalon Museum of Art Gala unfolded with impeccable sophistication. Journalists competed for angles, business people exchanged promises, and politicians offered calculated laughs. Yet behind every smile flickered a possibility, and Ken felt the note burning in his jacket like a secret beacon pointing into the shadows. Victoria Griffin glided among the guests with the elegance of someone who had always known how to manipulate glances, her blue dress marking each step as if it were a signature in the air. Adrian Cross maintained his usual theatricality, his voice booming with enthusiasm as he told a story of risky investments that seemed staged to divert attention. Nathan Griffin remained close to the bar, his glass of whiskey almost glued to his lips, but his eyes held a mixture of resentment and contempt that required no words. Ken circulated among the tables, distributing gestures and handshakes, but each contact was analyzed like a clue on a suspicion board. Marcus Chin's bodyguards were scattered like invisible pieces, identifiable only by the watchful eyes that tracked every irregular movement. The chandeliers reflected 1,000 fragments of light onto the marble walls, but it felt as if each reflection hid a lurking shadow. The speech waiting to be delivered lay in his pocket, ready to be delivered, but to Ken it was just an excuse for everyone to be gathered under one roof. Adrian's handshake lasted a second longer than it should have, and in his palm there was a pressure that seemed to carry a silent challenge. Victoria kissed her brother's cheek with practiced delicacy, but her cold eyes did not disguise the distance that had always existed between them. Nathan muttered something that was lost in the sound of the glasses, but Ken didn't need to hear it. The bitterness was as clear as the drink in the glass. The note echoed in his mind. It's a trap, like a beat that blended with the orchestra's beat. And with each passing second, the billionaire became more certain that this was not just a warning, but a map pointing to a traitor hidden among familiar faces. Ken felt a chill run down his spine as he met Dylan Brooks's eyes again. The boy was sitting in a discreet corner, next to his mother, Abigail Hayes, who kept her hands restlessly in her lap. The boy's eyes revealed the fear of someone who knew more than he could tell, and this silent truth made Ken feel watched by an innocence that didn't know how to lie. Abigail avoided eye contact, but her body betrayed nervousness. Each breath was shallow, each movement calculated as if she feared awakening something dangerous. Ken realized that their very presence in the room was a message, perhaps a bait, perhaps a trap deeper than it seemed. The quartet changed the tone of the music, but Ken's heart beat with a different rhythm, faster, darker, as if marking the time of an invisible countdown. Glasses clinked in the background, and the murmur of the guests seemed like a smokescreen that hid the true melody of the evening. Ethan Cole appeared like a shadow in the reflection of a bronze sculpture, moving naturally between the groups, but the trained eye missed no detail. He made an almost imperceptible gesture toward Ken, signaling that he remained attentive, that each suspicion was being noted like a piece in a puzzle. Ken took a deep breath and realized that, despite all the protocols, the enemy didn't need visible weapons. He just needed patience. Victoria laughed with a group of businessmen, but the sound was too sharp, too empty, as if it were hiding shards behind the melody. Adrian gestured with exaggerated euphoria, with each word trying to dominate the attention that did not completely belong to him. Nathan remained glued to the glass, but his expression wasn't one of distraction. It was one of someone awaiting an inevitable outcome. The note seemed to pulse in his jacket pocket, each fold of paper reverberating against his chest as if it were part of his own body. Ken knew that no matter how much he smiled or how much he pretended to be normal, the room had already turned into a silent battlefield. Marcus Chin's approach shattered the scene like a shadow crossing the light. He leaned in discreetly and murmured something brief, barely audible, but enough to chill Ken's blood. One of his men had confirmed that the suspicious waiter was not part of the museum's hired staff. The information sounded simple, but carried the gravity of a sentence. There was a direct infiltration into the heart of the gala. Ken covered it with a smile and a polite wave to a nearby group, but cold sweat was already trickling down his perfectly straight collar. Every detail now seemed like a clue: the nervous glance of a guest, the slight tremor of a tray, the hesitation in a step. Marcus stepped back as if nothing had happened, but the message remained clear. The ghosts that stalked the night were closer than anyone could ever imagine. Ethan, in the background, met Ken's gaze and made a quick gesture, asking for calm, like someone holding the reins of a sprinting horse. The billionaire adjusted his cuffs and resumed moving between the tables, but now every smile seemed like a farce that hid invisible daggers. The golden glow of the chandeliers was no longer a symbol of luxury, but the cold reflection of blades ready to attack. Ken realized that the game was moving faster than he had imagined, and that with each step into the room, he became the centerpiece of a plot that allowed no retreat. The eyes fixed on Victoria and Adrian, and for a moment he felt like the answer he was looking for might be right there, smiling beneath the flashes. His heart was racing, and his heavy breathing betrayed that his next move was about to be revealed. And when the curtains of the hall moved with a sudden draft, he understood that the trap was not a distant metaphor, but a reality breathing just a few meters away. The wall clock in the main hall was striking 8 p.m. sharp when Ken Griffin felt the weight of the moment. The internal timer that had always guided him in meetings and negotiations now seemed to be tied to an invisible compass, where each beat of the hand echoed like a countdown. The Avalon Museum of Art Gala was going flawlessly before the guests, but behind the columns, the breathing of Marcus Chin's security guards betrayed latent tension. Ken walked to the central table, where the speeches would begin, and rested his hand on the polished glass surface, feeling the cold of the table as if it were the skin of the night itself. His eyes rose to the ceiling, and the skylight reflected the brightness of the New York stars mixed with the artificial lamps, reminding him that reality and illusion were blurring. Victoria Griffin moved with studied grace, greeting politicians and business people as if she already knew that sooner or later the attention would return to her. Adrian Cross observed the scene from a strategic point, his smile too calculated to be just sympathy, his posture rigid as if waiting for the exact moment to make a prepared gesture. Nathan Griffin remained at the bar, his body limp with alcohol, but his eyes maintained a disturbing sobriety, as if hiding a bitter lucidity. Ken clutched the note in his jacket pocket, as if holding a truth that the world around him insists on ignoring. and realized that the invisible thread of the night was about to snap. A waiter crossed the room with firm steps, but his low gaze caught the attention of Ethan Cole, who moved discreetly, mingling with the guests. Marcus's almost imperceptible movement as he adjusted his jacket's lapel was the sign that the security guards had detected yet another inconsistency. Ken took a deep breath, maintaining his public smile, but inside his throat felt dry and his muscles stiff, as if every gesture were being rehearsed in front of an invisible audience. The flashes exploded in succession, immortalizing the image of a self-assured host, but the heart betrayed the opposite with irregular beats. The music stopped for a brief moment, and the silence seemed to stretch longer than it should, creating an emptiness that held foreboding. It was in this space between chords that Ken realized the trap was not just external, it was already among them, breathing the same air and waiting for the moment to reveal itself. Abigail Hayes watched her boss from a distance, sitting next to her son, Dylan Brooks, her hands constantly twisting the cloth napkin into a shapeless knot. The boy fixed his eyes on Ken, as if still seeking confirmation that his initial gesture had been understood, that the 5 words had not fallen into a void. With every false smile that crossed the room, Dylan felt the weight of being just a child in the middle of a game he didn't fully understand, but whose danger he could recognize. Abigail tried to maintain her composure, but the cold sweat on her forehead betrayed the fear that had consumed her since she had, against her will, agreed to be part of that scheme. Ken noticed the maid's gaze and understood, without words, that the woman carried an unspoken truth, suffocated by threats that went beyond her courage. Ethan Cole sidled up to the side of the table, giving Ken a quick, steady look that said silently, "There are more eyes here than we can count." The billionaire adjusted his jacket and smiled at a French businessman who asked for a photo, but inside he felt his stomach tighten as if anticipating a blow. Victoria raised her glass in a spontaneous toast, drawing stares, and for a moment Ken wondered if this impromptu celebration might be the perfect cover for the beginning of something bigger. Adrian, beside him, squeezed his shoulder a little too tightly, a gesture that hid a challenge masquerading as camaraderie. Nathan laughed out loud at some unfunny joke, but the sound was more mockery than joy, echoing in the air like a portent. Abigail's napkin fell to the floor, and Dylan bent down to pick it up, but in the quick reflection of the polished floor, Ken saw the glint of fearful, childlike eyes. It was then that he understood. The boy's innocence was the only thing that could not be faked, and it was this detail that prevented him from giving in to the party script. The words of the note resurfaced in his mind, not as a warning, but as confirmation that the night was already walking on invisible shards. The orchestra started again with violins in a higher key, but the melody sounded like strings about to burst. And as he looked up again, Ken had the distinct feeling that the next game piece was about to fall onto the board. Suddenly, one of Marcus Chin's security guards approached discreetly, his expression carrying a tension that didn't match the festive atmosphere. He murmured in the security chief's ear, and Marcus masked it with a brief nod of approval, but his eyes immediately sought Ken's, full of warning. Ken waved back imperceptibly, his heart racing in short bursts, sensing that the shiny surface of the party was about to shatter. The suspicious waiter had disappeared through a side door, and 2 undercover agents followed him without attracting attention, but his absence left a heavy, empty space in the air. Victoria, in the midst of conversation, gave her brother a fleeting, cold, distant look, as if she knew something he hadn't yet discovered. Adrian laughed loudly at any comment, but his eyes remained hard, fixed, ready like blades hidden in velvet gloves. Nathan, half drunk, spilled some of his drink on the counter, and the banal gesture felt like a cruel metaphor for his own decadence. Ken realized that every detail was connected, that nothing in the room was truly random, and that the note was just the first piece revealed in a larger puzzle. The invisible weight pressed down on his chest, but instinct told him to remain calm, to avoid presenting the spectacle of a host losing control. The conversations, laughter, and music continued, but everything seemed distant, as if the room had been transformed into a theater stage where everyone was playing roles that hid truths. Ethan Cole stood motionless beside a Roman sculpture, but his eyes roamed every face, every gesture, mapping it like a soldier in a minefield. Abigail, in the background, kept holding Dylan's hand, and the boy seemed torn between fear and the courage to tell him again what he knew. Ken lifted his glass of water and moistened his lips, a simple gesture that hid the dilemma of a man faced with absolute uncertainty. The wall clock advanced another minute, and the metallic sound of its hands echoed louder than it should have. And in that instant, Ken realized that the night had just crossed an invisible border, and that from then on, nothing would remain in the same place. The murmur of the hall seemed to compose a background melody, but to Ken Griffin each laugh sounded like a disguise for hidden intentions. The waiter reappeared, balancing the tray with glasses that shone under the chandeliers like small liquid suns. The guests held out their hands, confident in the apparent normality of the night, without imagining that each sip could carry more than celebration. Ken watched the movement with a calculated eye, remembering the note and the earlier refusal, aware that the trap would not come in obvious forms. The man approached a group of businessmen, insisted, and was rejected with suspicious politeness. His eyes wavered for a moment, nervous. Ethan Cole, positioned near the stairs, noticed the anomaly and made a slight gesture with his head, as if marking an invisible target. Marcus Chun, attentive to the corner of the room, passed the instructions over the discreet radio. Two undercover men began to follow the waiter without losing the rhythm of the music. Ken moistened his lips with a sip of water, keeping a calm expression for the photographers, but inside his stomach burned with the certainty that he had just escaped by a hair's breadth. Victoria raised her glass in a spontaneous toast, the crystal vibrating in the light as if it were the symbol of a secret victory. Adrian grinned, slamming his palm on the table, as if celebration were reason enough to cover up something deeper. Nathan, leaning against the counter, let out a bitter laugh that echoed through the space, and Ken couldn't decide if it was mockery or simple ruin. The entire room seemed to conspire, every detail carrying meanings that only a few eyes knew how to decipher. The orchestra resumed the music with intensity, as if covering the invisible noises of the night, but the notes no longer had any softness. They sounded like tense strings about to break. Ken maintained his posture, but felt his blood race faster, as if his heart wanted to warn him that the next move was underway. And when he met Ethan's gaze, he realized that the danger hadn't passed. He had simply changed form, waiting for the moment to reveal himself. With each passing second, the sense of theater became more evident, as if each guest were an unwitting actor in a play whose script Ken was trying to guess. The museum's white columns reflected elongated shadows, creating figures that seemed to move on their own. The ancient sculptures, illuminated by points of light, assumed severe expressions, like guardians of a secret about to be discovered. The smell of champagne mixed with the perfume of flowers created an almost suffocating atmosphere, transforming luxury into a golden prison. Ken walked between the groups with a practiced smile, but his eyes tracked every detail, alert for the slightest signs of failure. Victoria approached him with a kiss on the cheek, and for an instant, the coldness in her gaze seemed to cut deeper than any weapon. Adrian, always glued to her, displayed an exaggerated friendliness, as if trying to put on a mask that didn't fit. Nathan, for his part, remained distant, but his presence weighed as much as the others, as his resentment was enough fuel for any conspiracy. Ken took a deep breath and remembered his grandfather's words. The true enemy rarely appears head-on, preferring the shadow that moves around him. The note seemed to vibrate against his chest, repeating the warning like a mantra impossible to ignore. Ethan stood firm, discreet, but his eyes remained alert like hidden headlights, ready to react. Marcus approached for a few seconds and muttered something brief. "We have him under control." The waiter had been intercepted. Ken didn't answer, just nodded, maintaining the public expression of a serene host, while inside every muscle braced for the next turn. The immediate risk had been neutralized, but the feeling that this was only the prelude grew, as if the night were opening deeper layers of an invisible plot. And in that silent interval, the billionaire realized he was facing not just one attack, but an entire orchestra of calculated moves converging on him. Ken's breathing quickened as the spotlights were adjusted towards the stage, indicating that the speech was near. The guests clapped, creating a buzz of anticipation, and the microphone waited in the center as if it were the altar for that night. He walked to the side, adjusting his posture, but his gaze remained fixed on the corners of the room, where shadows moved with hidden intentions. Ethan leaned in discreetly, his gaze sharp as a blade, indicating that something was still not under control. Marcus, in the background, spoke quietly to his men, and the rapid movement of their heads signaled that there were pieces in play that had not yet been captured. Ken rested his hand on the lectern, the cold metal piercing his skin, and took a deep breath as if preparing not just a speech, but a confrontation. The cameras were positioned, flashes went off, and silence fell, demanding from him the word that would inaugurate the night. The text was folded in his pocket, but his mind saw only Dylan's shaky handwriting, simple and definitive. "Don't panic. It's a trap," echoed in his head, repeated like a sentence that now mingled with his own breathing. Ken looked up at the audience, and every face seemed to hold a secret. Victoria's smile, Adrian's anxiety, Nathan's poisonous boredom. The orchestra's notes ceased, and for a moment, the entire museum seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the host's voice. He took another breath, but before he could speak, a siren cut through the air, vibrating like thunder ripping through the sky on a summer night. The sound was not planned, it was not part of the ceremony, and each guest reacted with genuine surprise. Ken froze inside, because he recognized that this wasn't just a technical alarm. It was the next move of the trap unfolding before everyone, transforming the gala into a stage of imminent chaos. The shrill sound of the alarm ripped through the hall like an invisible blade, shattering the harmony of the violins and plunging the Avalon Museum of Art Gala into disarray. The lights flickered for a moment before settling into a flashing red, painting the guests' faces with a ghostly pallor. The clink of glasses falling to the floor mingled with the muffled screams of those searching for exits, and the air now carried a metallic odor of smoke coming from the lower floors. Ken Griffin stood still for a second, his eyes scanning the room for an explanation, while inside he felt his heart pound against his ribs. Victoria grabbed Adrian Cross's arm, who feigned surprise, but his eyes betrayed the anxiety of someone waiting for exactly that moment. Nathan, staggering, almost dropped his glass, but he seemed strangely awake, as if the siren had washed away his drunkenness in an instant. Marcus Chun was already on the move, speaking into the radio clipped to his lapel, his undercover men threading their way through the guests like disguised shadows. Ethan Cole discreetly gestured to Ken, indicating the side of the room where the commotion was less, but the billionaire's eyes refused to look away before he understood the threat. The red glow reflected off the marbles like liquid blood, transforming the museum into a nightmare scene. The photographers tried to capture the scene, but were swallowed up by the flow of people rushing haphazardly towards the doors. Ken held his breath and understood that the night had entered a new phase. The trap had stopped being silent and had become a spectacle. With each passing second, the feeling that everyone was inside a dark machine grew, and the idea that there might be something bigger behind it burned like embers in his mind. Victoria gave him one last fleeting glance, cold and enigmatic, before being swept away by the tide of guests. Adrian smiled discreetly, too quick to be noticed by anyone else, but enough to confirm the worst of omens. And in that instant, Ken knew. The alarm wasn't a malfunction. It was the first act of a larger plan beginning to unfold. The museum corridors became rivers of hurried footsteps, and the click of high heels echoed like gunshots against the marble walls. Abigail Hayes gripped Dylan Brooks's hand tightly, dragging her son through the crowd, but the boy's eyes never left Ken. The boy seemed to want to say more, as if he still kept secrets unwritten in the note, but the confusion did not give him a voice. Ken walked across the side room with Ethan, his breathing shallow and heavy, the note now clutched to his chest like a survival charm. Marcus intercepted them, his expression hard and his voice muffled with urgency. "We found something underground. Loads, several." The word hung in the air, too heavy, until Ethan finished coldly. "Explosives." Ken felt a chill run down his spine, and confirmation came quickly. The false fire had triggered the alarm, but the real threat was hidden beneath everyone's feet. The imposing columns, the gleaming marble, and the works of art were nothing more than fragile props in the face of what could be the collapse of the entire structure. The billionaire clenched his fists, understanding that the plan had never been just a discreet assassination, but a calculated spectacle of mass destruction. Ethan rested his hand on her shoulder, firm, his eyes clear as steel. "They want more than your death. They want your legacy buried with you." Marcus received another radio transmission, and the tension rose. The enemy was inside, detonator in hand, biding their time. Ken closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his grandfather and his words about invisible battles, and realized he couldn't back down. The crowd fled, but the choice wasn't between leaving or staying. It was between surviving alone or facing the shadow to save hundreds. He opened his eyes, steady as ever, and stared at Ethan and Marcus. "If necessary, we will fight in the fire." And with that silent oath, the night definitively became a battlefield. As the hallways vibrated with footsteps and shouts, Ken realized the cruel irony. The gala that celebrated his generosity had become a trap for his downfall. Cameras were still recording, journalists were still searching for images, and chaos was spreading across screens around the world without anyone knowing the truth. Victoria and Adrian had disappeared from view, slipping into the shadows of panic, and Nathan remained mysteriously out of focus. The invisible detonator could be in any pocket, in any hand, waiting for the gesture that would turn the night into tragedy. Ken pushed against the current, thwarted by the logic that urged escape, but driven by the duty that only he seemed to hear. Ethan followed beside him, his every step echoing discipline, his every glance like radar. Marcus was coordinating the evacuation, but his expression showed that he wasn't relying on luck alone. The entire museum was marked as a scene of destruction. The pulsating red of the lights blended with the golden reflection of the sculptures, as if centuries of art were silently observing the birth of a massacre. Ken took a deep breath, absorbing the contrast between beauty and terror, and realized that fate was demanding an answer from him. Dylan's note had started it all, but now it was her courage that would carry the night. He knew there was no turning back, that he couldn't just walk through those doors and leave the danger behind. The real game was not in the escape, but in the confrontation. And when his eyes met Ethan's again, he understood that they were both ready to turn that hunt into an ambush. The alarm continued howling, but to Ken it was no longer noise. It was the call to battle that was just beginning. And in the red darkness of the museum, he decided he wouldn't be the prey, he would be the hunter. The upper floor of the Avalon Museum of Art seemed to breathe in silence, as if aware of the chaos unfolding in the halls below. Ken Griffin climbed the wide steps, each step echoing like hammer blows, his heart racing with the knowledge that the enemy's eyes were upon him. The columns cast long shadows that moved in time with the flashing red lights, transforming the corridor into the scene of an engineered nightmare. In the background, the murmur of the guests still echoed, but up there the atmosphere was different, heavy, dense, as if time were dragging on. Ethan Cole stood a few steps behind, his eyes scanning every shop window, every corner, attentive to the smallest detail out of place. Marcus Chun, in constant radio contact, reported that the evacuation was continuing, but his dry tone revealed concern. Some access points had already been blocked. Ken knew that with every minute lost, the chance of everyone getting out alive decreased. Dylan's note burned in his pocket, reminding him that tonight wasn't just about him, but about manipulated innocence and the price of silence. Suddenly, a murmur of familiar voices was heard. Victoria Griffin emerged into the hallway, looking flawless, as if the chaos below hadn't touched her. Her eyes, however, held something darker. Beside her, Adrian Cross wore a tense, theatrical smile, sustained more by arrogance than calm. Ken stopped before them, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to that encounter. The shared blood made the confrontation inevitably more painful, but betrayal pulsed in the air like an open wound. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice soft but filled with concealed venom. "You should have left, Ken." And at that moment, the billionaire was sure that the family mask was about to fall completely. Ken's gaze slid to Adrian, and the tension in his jaw was proof that he was waiting for something. A gesture, an explosion, an end. The brother-in-law raised his hands in a false conciliatory tone, but his eyes did not hide the feverish glow of ambition. "All of this could have been avoided," he said, his voice thick with false compassion. "But you never knew how to share, never knew how to see beyond your own empire." The words were veiled stabs, revealing resentments that had been growing like silent poison. Victoria crossed her arms, her fingers stiff, and added coldly, "You've become too attached to your grandfather's memory. That legacy doesn't belong to us, Ken. It belongs to the entire family." Ken took a deep breath, keeping his posture rigid, but inside, pain gnawed at him. Each sentence seemed to dismantle not only his trust, but the memory of their shared blood. Ethan, nearby, watched silently, ready to react, but he knew this was an emotional battlefield as much as a physical one. Ken's heart was heavy, but his eyes remained steady, unwavering, because he understood that the enemy was no longer hiding. It was revealing itself before him, bearing his own surname. Adrian stepped forward, his smile fading into a hard expression. "You're not getting out of here alive. And when it all comes crashing down, no one will remember your name with glory, only as a failure." The words echoed through the empty hallway, sharper than the distant siren. Victoria remained silent, but her silence was more accusatory than any speech. Ken clenched his fists, and in that gesture there was both anger and pain, a mixture that transformed him into something new, forged by the fire of betrayal. His heart raced not only because of the threat, but because of the irreversible loss he already felt. And when Ethan subtly placed his hand on her arm, it was like a reminder. There was no turning back. The mask game was over, and from then on, everything would be exposed in harsh light. Suddenly, a metallic clang reverberated through the floor, coming from one of the side doors that led to the antique storeroom. Ken, Ethan, Victoria, and Adrian all turned their heads at the same time, but each interpreted the sound differently. For Ken, it was a sign that the trap was moving toward its final phase. For Victoria, an unexpected threat. For Adrian, perhaps a sign of impatience from his hidden ally. The echo of the noise spread through the hallway, mingling with the continuous sound of the alarm, and for an instant, the world seemed suspended. Ethan discreetly reached for the holster under his jacket, his eyes narrowing in warning. Ken remained motionless, but inside he felt every nerve vibrate like a string about to snap. Victoria took a step back, the movement revealing not fear but calculation. She was assessing escape routes. Adrian gritted his teeth, impatience etched on his face, as if he wanted everything to be resolved there and then, with a single gesture. Ken took a deep breath and realized that the night had presented him with the cruelest dilemma: save his life or save his legacy. And when the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps running towards them, he understood that he would have no choice. The ultimate confrontation would not only be against hidden enemies, but against the very blood that had chosen the side of darkness. The corridor was now the scene of a silent trial, where the sentence would be written in steel and fire. And Ken knew, with piercing clarity, that the next minute would define not only the fate of the gala, but the future of his entire lineage. It was at that moment that he understood there was no more time for hesitation. The enemy was inside the house, and the house was about to collapse. The rumble that had echoed through the corridors seemed to have dissipated, but in its place was a heavy silence, as if the entire museum was awaiting an outcome. Ken Griffin stood still for a few seconds, measuring each breath, his eyes scanning the shadows for the next move. It was then that, at the end of the room, the waiter appeared again, balancing a silver tray. The contrast between his apparent calm and the growing tension of the environment sounded like an off-key note in the midst of the night's symphony. He walked with calculated steps, his posture impeccable, as if he had rehearsed every gesture so as not to arouse suspicion. The guests who were still there, confused by the alarm, looked at him with relief, accepting glasses that symbolized normality amidst the chaos. Ken, however, looked deeper, noticing the man's gaze. There was no rush, no desperation, just a contained anxiety that didn't suit a simple employee. Ethan Cole approached from the side, his hands discreetly poised for action, but the waiter didn't deviate from his path. With the naturalness of someone performing a ritual, she extended a glass toward Ken, her eyes fixed as if awaiting a specific gesture. The billionaire felt his throat dry and, for a moment, he considered accepting to keep up the charade, but a slight shake of Ethan's head made him back off. "No, thank you," Ken said, his voice calm but firm, eliciting the slightest reaction from the waiter, a quick blink, a trace of barely concealed frustration. The detail was enough for Marcus Chun, observing from the side gallery, to discreetly call two of his men. Glasses clinked in the hall, but the sound seemed distant, irrelevant to the suspicion that had now become certainty. Ken stood straight, flashing calculated smiles, but deep down he already understood. This was no mere employee, he was the loose end of a larger conspiracy. And when the waiter veered off toward another group, the chill down Ken's spine confirmed that the night was approaching the point of no return. The red lights continued to flash overhead, each flash transforming the guests' faces into distorted masks of fear and anxiety. Abigail Hayes, still holding Dylan Brooks's hand tightly, watched the scene from a distance, and her maternal instinct made her tremble. She recognized danger in the most subtle gesture. The boy, wide-eyed, seemed to realize the same thing. His innocence grasped what the adults disguised with protocol. Ken looked away from them for a moment, feeling that somehow this child had become the guiding thread of his survival. Ethan, attentive, moved like a shadow, following the waiter's route while feigning interest in a nearby sculpture. Marcus spoke into the radio in a low tone, instructing his men not to act immediately. They wanted to know who he was reporting to, what he would hand over after the failed attempt. Ken understood the strategy, but every second he saw that man walking across the room was a cruel test of his nerves. The sound of the alarm mixed with the screams of guests looking for exits. But in that area, time seemed to slow down, every detail taking on enormous weight. Victoria and Adrian had disappeared from view, and their absence made the scene even more ominous. Nathan remained close to the bar, oblivious to the obvious tension, but his lost gaze could hide much more than simple disinterest. Ken felt a cold sweat run down the back of his neck, and for a moment he thought the night might end there, in front of everyone's eyes, disguised as a natural tragedy. The note pulsed in his memory, like a reminder that this trap had been foreseen, but it was still more cruel than he had imagined. And when Ethan sent a vibrating signal to Ken's watch, the message was clear. The waiter wasn't the ultimate danger, he was just the piece that opened the way. The game wasn't close to over, it was just entering its most dangerous phase. And realizing this, Ken understood that he needed to keep acting, smiling, until the enemy revealed his hidden hand. Minutes later, an undercover security guard returned to Marcus Chun and murmured the confirmation everyone had been dreading. The waiter had been followed to a service exit, where he made a quick cell phone call to a disposable number. The words were few, but revealing. He refused. The silence that followed the report was heavier than any scream. Ken realized that refusing the cup had not only saved his life, but also triggered the next phase of the plan. Ethan approached, his expression hard, his jaw clenched, muttering low enough not to be heard, "They know you know." The revelation fell like ice inside him, because it meant that the conspiracy was no longer silent and now assumed the risk of direct confrontation. The hall was no longer just an observation deck, it had become an arena. The heavy drapes, the marble steps, the glittering chandeliers, everything looked like the setting for a show whose climax was about to arrive. Ken took a deep breath, and decision burned in his eyes. He would not back down. No matter how elaborate the ambush, he would face the night until the last move. Dylan watched from afar, and the tension in his childlike gaze was like a mirror of the truth. Nothing in that room was safe. Marcus tightened his grip on the radio, his dry voice issuing a simple order: "Follow. Find out who's calling." And as the security guards disappeared into the maze of corridors, Ken realized that each step brought them closer to the final revelation, but also closer to destruction. For now, there was no doubt. The ghosts within the museum were already in position to attack. The museum's side corridor was plunged into shadows when Marcus Chun received the radio transmission. His expression, which rarely betrayed emotion, became a mask of gravity as he heard the words of his undercover men. The waiter had been captured discreetly, without fanfare, and what he had in his pockets dispelled any hope that it was just paranoia. Inside the lining of the vest, they found a tiny vial of clear liquid, cataloged by experts as a substance capable of inducing a heart attack in minutes. The cup Ken Griffin refused wasn't just a drink, it was the sentence itself, carefully disguised as elegance. Marcus looked up at the host, who stood among the guests as if nothing had happened, giving diplomatic smiles as his breathing became heavy. Ethan Cole, standing a few feet back, caught Marcus's eye and understood immediately. The night had turned into open field. Ken, even without hearing the confirmation, already felt the weight of the truth in his body, as if every muscle was prepared to react. The guests continued laughing, toasting and commenting on the grandeur of the event, oblivious to the invisible thread that separated life from death. Victoria Griffin reappeared in the ballroom with Adrian Cross at her side, both radiating practiced naturalness, but now the suspicion surrounding them was palpable. Nathan, standing back, still had his drink in his hand, but his eyes followed every movement like a predator on the prowl. Ken held his breath, maintaining a mask of serenity, but inside him the truth roared. The trap was already in operation, and he was walking on minefields. Dylan Brooks's note echoed in his mind like a prophecy fulfilled, and deep in his chest, the conviction grew. Refusing the cup had been just the first act of a much greater battle. The knight didn't just want his life. It wanted his complete ruin, and that could only be the work of someone who knew every detail of his world. As the orchestra tried to regain the rhythm with soft chords, the museum's farthest corridors became hunting corridors. Two security guards followed Marcus's orders, taking the waiter under restraint to an isolated room in the basement. The cold concrete walls echoed with the sound of firm footsteps, each shoe tap reverberating like a prelude to confession. The man maintained a rigid posture, but his eyes betrayed the tension of someone carrying more than he should. Marcus knew it wouldn't take much for the truth to come out. Professionals paid to execute plans rarely resist when they realize they've been abandoned. Ethan, over the radio, heard every word exchanged, and his mind calculated possibilities, setting up the board with military coolness. Ken, however, couldn't ignore the pain throbbing in his chest at the thought that the conspiracy had come from within, from the inner circle that was supposed to protect him. His eyes returned to Victoria, who was smiling at a foreign politician as if nothing were at stake, but there was something in the way she looked away that tore at him. Adrian spoke animatedly, but his hand was always close to the inside pocket of his jacket, as if he kept more than just documents there. Nathan laughed at the counter, but the laughter was hollow, echoing as a disguise for the shadow that had already settled inside him. Ken took a deep breath, remembering the discipline he had inherited from his grandfather, and decided to remain standing, because the night was demanding courage. The golden glow of the chandeliers contrasted with the suffocating tension, transforming luxury into prison. The note remained stuck to his chest, a symbol of a warning that was confirmed every minute. And when Ethan sent a brief signal on his watch, Ken understood. The truth was closer than it had ever been. But with it came the certainty that the explosion was not yet literal. It was emotional, and it was about to tear apart the deepest bonds of her life. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the museum was plunged into brief seconds of darkness until emergency generators took over. The guests screamed, some ran, others jostled in panic, but Ken stood firm in the center of the room. The flashing red of the alarms reflected on each person's face, painting them like characters in a macabre theater. Marcus received another transmission. The waiter, before being taken away, had made a short but decisive call. The message was clear, direct, impossible to interpret any other way. He knows. Ken felt the ground shake beneath his feet, as if those two words had the power to rewrite the entire night. The enemy, hidden in the shadows, was already aware that his trap had been discovered, and this meant that the next steps would be even more brutal. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his muscles tense like a rope about to snap, prepared for the onslaught he knew was inevitable. Ken reached into his pocket, feeling Dylan's folded paper like an anchor in a stormy sea. Victoria and Adrian disappeared back into the hallways, and Nathan slipped out of the bar, leaving behind only the empty glass. The billionaire understood that the pieces were moving in an orchestrated manner, and he was at the center of the board. The chandeliers swayed slightly with the vibration of the alarm, scattering reflections that looked like flames into the eyes of those present. The silence after the screams was even more cruel, as if the world was holding its breath. Ken knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that the ultimate revelation was near. And when he heard the metallic click of a heavy door closing somewhere in the museum, he understood that the game had advanced to its most dangerous phase. The entire museum shook as the fire alarm changed pitch, a deeper howl that reverberated through the halls like an ancient warning. The emergency lights began to flash in sequence, plunging the guests into a choreography of red and white shadows that intensified the panic. The smell of smoke was spreading rapidly from the basement's technical areas, and heat began to creep in through the ventilation ducts. Women screamed, shoes hit the marble, glasses shattered on the floor, creating a soundtrack of despair. Ken Griffin stood motionless for a few seconds, and it was at that moment that he realized the mass evacuation was no mere coincidence. Someone had calculated every detail, from triggering the alarm to positioning the locked doors. Ethan Cole tugged at his arm, but Ken steadied himself, his eyes scanning the room for Victoria and Adrian, who had disappeared. Nathan, staggering with the bottle in his hand, seemed oblivious, but his husky laugh cut through the air as if he knew more than he pretended. Marcus Chun emerged from between the security guards, his face sweaty and his voice dry on the radio. "Explosives. We found them underground. Enough charges to bring down the entire annex." The words hit Ken like a blade to the chest. This wasn't just a personal assassination attempt. It was a declaration of war against everyone. Dylan Brooks's note, simple and childlike, proved to be more than a warning. It was the line between life and death. Ken swallowed hard, keeping his face straight before the guests, but inside a gale was raging. The museum, once a temple of art, was now transformed into a glass cage about to shatter. And when a metallic crack echoed from the upper galleries, the final confirmation arrived. The enemy was inside, ready to close the siege. It was the beginning of destruction, and he knew he couldn't just run away. The main doors were opened, but the flow of people crashed against the invisible blockade of confusion, creating a sea of disordered bodies. Abigail Hayes tried to drag Dylan by the hand, her heart racing, but the boy kept looking back at Ken, as if waiting for one last reaction. The child did not need to speak. His eyes said that the danger had not yet fully revealed itself. Ken stood erect in the center of the room, feeling the temptation to run, but forcefully rejecting it. The blood in his veins burned with the memory of his grandfather, who had faced battles without ever giving in to the instinct to flee. Ethan leaned in, his voice low as steel. "They want to tear down the whole building. But before that, they want you on stage." The billionaire understood the cruel calculation. His death would be a spectacle, justified by collective tragedy, and no one would suspect internal betrayal. Victoria and Adrian were nowhere to be found, and this confirmed the suspicion that was already burning. Nathan, in the background, dropped the bottle, and the shattered glass sounded like a sentence. Marcus was coordinating the survivors' exit, but his gaze returned to Ken, waiting for the decision that would change everything. Ken clutched the note to his chest, feeling the paper damp with sweat, and understood that his life was no longer his own. Each person still trapped in the museum depended on their choice. And when he looked up at the stairs, he knew the way was up, not out. It was there, in the heart of the trap, that he would discover who held the detonator. And in that instant, fear transformed into something new, determination. The sound of sirens outside began to arrive, distantly, announcing the arrival of firefighters and police, but the sound seemed insignificant compared to reality. If the detonator were triggered, no rescue team would have time to save the innocent. Ken looked at Ethan, and the silence between them was a pact. They would not run away. Marcus approached, the radio hissing in his hand. "We have confirmation. The remote device is with someone on the 3rd floor. We need to act now." The billionaire took a deep breath, his face reflecting the red lights, and felt the night weigh more heavily than ever. Fate had narrowed into a single corridor. Either he faced betrayal from his own family, or they would all die under the rubble. The memory of Dylan and Abigail, fragile and true, rekindled the flame of responsibility in him. The child had risked everything for him. Now it was his turn to risk it for everyone. Ken squared his shoulders and pointed toward the stairs, his voice firm as a military command. "Let's finish this." And as Ethan and Marcus followed him, the entire museum seemed to vibrate, as if the walls knew the final confrontation was approaching. The ancient sculptures, motionless in their display cases, were silent witnesses to a present about to become ruin. The heat underground intensified, the smell of smoke burned in his lungs, but Ken didn't look away. Time seemed to run faster, each step one less beat on the invisible clock that counted down to the end. And when the siren changed frequency again, a higher-pitched sound, his heart sank. The detonator was ready to be activated. The night no longer demanded survival. It demanded sacrifice. The marble steps seemed endless as Ken Griffin strode up, followed by Ethan Cole and protected at a distance by Marcus Chun. The air grew heavier with each floor, carrying not only the smoke rising from underground, but the tension that throbbed like a war drum. On the third floor, the hallway leading to the antiques wing was plunged into darkness, lit only by the emergency lights flashing red. The display cases displayed ancient artifacts, ceremonial masks, ancient urns, weapons forged centuries ago, as if all of history were silently watching the present crumble. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional crackling of pipes heated by smoke. It was then that Marcus's radio crackled with static before a firm voice cut through, confirmed. C4 charges wired to the foundations of the new annex. The alarm was the first trigger. There's a second device, remote. Ken paused for a moment, his heart sinking. The enemy didn't just want to topple his symbolic empire. They wanted to bury everyone under tons of rubble. Ethan squeezed his shoulder firmly, as if to say without words, there was still a chance to turn this around. Ken took a deep breath, regaining his straight posture, even as the truth burned inside him. The gala had not been planned as a celebration, but as a stage for a calculated massacre. And as he digested this revelation, his mind kept returning to Dylan Brooks and Abigail Hayes. They had been used as fragile pieces, but they were the key to the truth. Without that note, he would be dead before he knew it. His grandfather's memories came back to him like an echo. The most dangerous enemy is always the one sitting at his table. And now, in the heart of the museum, Ken knew that lesson took on new weight. For the detonator was in the hands of someone close, someone who shared blood and secrets. And each step forward brought him closer to the revelation he feared more than the bombs themselves. The corridor narrowed, and at the end a pale light escaped through the half-open door of the vault in the antiquities wing. Ken slowed his pace, his eyes fixed on the illuminated gap, as if the source of all evil were concentrated there. Ethan raised his hand for absolute silence as Marcus told the men to discreetly surround the area. The radio crackled again, but this time the message was short, definitive, like a sentence. We've located the signal. The detonator is on the third floor. Richard Cross has it. Ken's world fell apart in a second. His brother-in-law, always present at family lunches, always a sycophant at public events, was responsible for the massacre. Bile rose in his throat, but the greatest pain was yet to come. The next confirmation pierced the radio like a knife. He's not alone. Victoria Griffin is with him. Ken felt his legs tremble, and for an instant, the weight of his entire existence seemed to crush him. His sister, the blood that had grown up with him in the halls of his grandfather's mansion, his childhood confidant, was now at the side of those who wanted to bury him alive. The silence that followed was so cruel it seemed to mock his disbelief. Ethan looked away for a moment, respecting the pain that didn't need to be spoken. Marcus, impassive, just awaited orders, but inside him there was a silent respect for the man who, in seconds, had lost more than his fortune. He had lost his own family. Ken closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let the pain turn into something colder, harder, determination. The traitor had a name, a face, and was just a few steps away. And now, no matter the cost, he would not allow the night to end in tragedy. Walking the last few meters of the corridor, Ken realized how much the museum had become a metaphor for his life. The imposing walls hid invisible cracks, just as his shining empire sheltered the shadow of envy and betrayal. The ancient sculptures, witnesses of past wars, seemed to recognize at that moment the birth of a new battlefield. Dylan's note burned against his chest like a brand, reminding him that courage can come from the most unlikely place. Ethan followed carefully, each step measured as if he were walking on glass about to shatter. Marcus prepared his men, but he knew that nothing would be more decisive than the upcoming confrontation. The glow escaping through the vault door guided them, an invitation and a threat at the same time. Ken swallowed hard and felt that each heartbeat was louder than the alarm that still echoed in the building. He no longer walked just as a businessman or heir, but as a soldier in a silent war that had been imposed on him. Brotherly love fought against the anger of betrayal, but the balance was already tipping towards the more implacable side. And when his fingers touched the cold surface of the doorknob, he knew there was no going back. In that room he would not find just bombs or plans, but the cruel face of the treachery that had haunted him from the beginning. The next moment would define everything. Who would live? Who would fall? Who would be remembered? And his breathing, steady and deep, marked the beginning of the confrontation that would echo not only that night, but throughout its history. Because by opening that door, Ken Griffin wouldn't just face enemies. He'd face the ghosts of his own family. The vault in the antiquities wing opened like the mouth of an ancient creature, revealing the heart of the plot that threatened to swallow them all. Ken Griffin walked forward slowly, feeling the ground vibrate beneath his feet, as if the museum itself were reacting to the weight of the revelation. Inside the circular room, the steel walls reflected the intermittent red light, transforming the space into an altar of shadows. In the center, Richard Cross held a small black device, the detonator, turning it in his fingers with the coolness of someone who had already decided fate. Beside him, Victoria Griffin stood motionless, her eyes watering but her posture erect, as if holding a conviction that consumed her from within. The silence between them was more deafening than the sirens echoing from underground, and Ken felt the air thin, hard to breathe. Ethan Cole positioned himself discreetly to the right, watching every move, while Marcus Chin kept 2 agents ready in the rear. Richard broke the silence with a dry laugh, devoid of mirth, just the sound of naked arrogance. "You're just in time to see your inheritance turn to dust." Ken clenched his fists, pain and fury mixing in a current that rose to his eyes. Victoria looked away, unable to fully face her brother, but she didn't move from Richard's side. Dylan Brooks's note burned against his chest as a cruel reminder that even a child had seen the trap that he, surrounded by power and security, had not seen coming. Richard raised the detonator, his thumb hovering over the button. "Everything you've built, this whole legacy charade, it ends today." Ken took a deep breath, feeling the spiral of emotions threaten to overwhelm him, but he kept his voice steady. "If you press that button, Richard, you won't just destroy me. You'll bury hundreds of innocent people." The brother-in-law smiled, his eyes cold as glass. Collateral. History always demands sacrifices. And in that moment, Ken realized there was no more room for negotiation. The end of the night would be written there, in blood or courage. Ken's heart was as heavy as lead, torn between the hatred that wanted to explode and the shattered love that still existed for Victoria. She finally looked up, and in the glint in them was something ambiguous, regret mixed with conviction. "Don't think this is just about him, Ken," she said, her voice cracking but firm. "We've always been shadows around him. We've always been less." The words cut deeper than any threat from Richard, because they carried years of pent-up resentment. Ken felt naked, as if every sacrifice, every achievement, had been reinterpreted in his sister's eyes as an insult. Ethan, at his side, narrowed his eyes, prepared to act, but he understood that this battle was not just physical. It was emotional, laden with invisible scars. Richard took a step forward, the device firmly in his hand, his smile widening. "She chose, Ken. She chose the truth you never wanted to see." The billionaire stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the two. "And I choose to fight, no matter the cost." Silence fell upon the room again, interrupted only by the hum of the ventilation system and the distant echo of the alarm. Victoria was breathing quickly, as if fighting something inside her, but she didn't back down. Richard, on the other hand, displayed the ruthless confidence of someone who believed he had already won. Ken looked at the detonator, the small object that weighed more than an entire empire. With every second, he felt the decision approaching: fight to prevent the end or resign himself to planned destruction. Dylan's note came back to me. 5 words that became prophecy: don't panic. It's a trap. And in that instant, Ken understood that the only way to win was to turn the tables on the trap's creators. Suddenly, a metallic click echoed inside the safe, coming from the locking system that automatically closed the doors in dangerous situations. The sound made the air freeze, because it meant that time had become even shorter. Space was turning into a cage. Richard held up the detonator, his eyes shining with triumph, as if that detail were the seal of his victory. Victoria shivered, looking around as if only now realizing that she, too, was trapped in the game she had helped create. Ken stood his ground, his body tense, but his mind was racing at feverish speed, searching for any opening. Ethan leaned in subtly, ready for a risky move, while Marcus, from the hallway, ordered absolute silence to the positioned agents. "It's over," Richard said, his tone grave, solemn, as if he were about to pronounce an irrevocable sentence. But before he could press the button, Ken stepped forward, his voice thick with steel. "If you destroy everything, Richard, you will never be remembered as a victor, only as a coward who killed innocents." For a moment, his brother-in-law's mask of safety wavered, and that crack was enough to rekindle Ken's flame of hope. Victoria looked from one to the other, torn, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something she dared not. The silence that followed was so tense that it seemed to vibrate in the air, like a string about to snap. Ken took a deep breath, knowing he was faced with an impossible choice: face the blood of his own family or let hundreds perish. His heart was beating hard, but his eyes were steady, and there was no longer any doubt in him. The battle wasn't just against Richard and Victoria. It was against the shadow that had always loomed over the Griffin name. And the decision was made. Whatever the cost, he would not allow the night to end in silence and ruin. The detonator trembled slightly in Richard's hand, not from doubt, but from the insane excitement that filled his eyes. Ken Griffin felt time fragment into seconds that weighed like hours, each instant laden with threat. The vault, lit only by the red emergency lights, seemed to pulse like a heart about to explode, turning every shadow into a harbinger of death. Victoria was breathing rapidly, as if caught between 2 irreconcilable forces: her brother's love and her twisted loyalty to her husband. Ethan Cole observed everything from a vantage point, calculating distances, assessing chances, aware that one wrong move could trigger tragedy. Marcus Chun, outside, awaited the order that never came, aware that the decision was now in the Griffin family's blood. Ken stepped forward, his voice rising, its echo firm even in the weight of the silence. "You think destroying my legacy will make you greater? It will only make you a cursed ghost." Richard laughed, the dry sound reverberating against the steel walls. "A ghost with a fortune is better than an heir trapped in the shadow of a dead general." The mention of his grandfather was like a blade piercing Ken's chest, but it also rekindled in him the strength he had inherited from the soldier. He realized he wasn't just facing an enemy. He was facing a distortion of his own ambition that was eating away at his family. The air grew thicker, breaths turning into harsh noises inside the closed room. Ken clenched his fists, every muscle ready to explode into action, but he knew he had to wait for the exact moment. Victoria let out a trembling whisper, "Richard, please," but her husband ignored her, his eyes fixed only on his brother-in-law. At that moment, everything converged to an invisible point, as if the entire universe was breathing, waiting for the next movement. And Ken knew that the battle was no longer just for the future of the Griffin name, but for the fate of every life that pulsed above their heads. The tension grew like fire spreading through a dry field, silent but inevitable. Richard stepped closer to the vault door, holding up the detonator like a trophy of power. Victoria took an uncertain step behind him, like a torn shadow, unable to break the spell of dependence that imprisoned her. Ken saw in his sister's eyes an invisible prison, built over the years, fueled by envy and the need for recognition. Ethan, attentive to every detail, noticed that his brother-in-law always kept his free hand close to the inside pocket of his jacket. There was something else there, perhaps a backup weapon, a second line of defense. Ken controlled his breathing, remembering his grandfather's lesson. In war, the most dangerous enemy is the one who believes he has nothing to lose. And before him, he saw exactly that, a man about to destroy not only an empire, but his own soul. Richard inclined his head, as if savoring the imminence of victory, and said, "Today, Ken, you cease to be an heir. Today, you become a memory." The phrase echoed inside the safe like a final sentence, and for a moment the silence seemed definitive. But Ken didn't back down. Every fiber of his body screamed to advance, to stop, to fight. And Victoria finally let out a tear that ran slowly, marking the cold mask she had worn until that moment. It was a sign of weakness, but also an opening, something that could change the course of the confrontation. Ken saw in her eyes a crack in the wall of resentment, and in that fragile detail lay the only chance to turn the tables before hell consumed them all. The metallic sound of the vault door closing completely resounded like the seal of an inevitable fate. Ken knew the space was now locked, isolated, and that any mistake would be a death sentence. Richard was breathing quickly, drunk on the power he felt as he held the detonator, his eyes shining like those of a man driven by madness. Victoria looked at her brother, and the internal war had already become visible on her face. The fine lines of her face betrayed the weight of an unbearable choice. Ken raised his voice, firm, cutting through the air. "There is still time, Victoria. Don't let the Griffin name be remembered like a tombstone." She shivered, but didn't respond, and Richard squeezed her arm roughly, silencing any words that might have come. Ethan took a half step forward, ready to intervene, but Ken discreetly raised his hand, urging calm, because there was still something to reveal. The internal clock seemed to accelerate, each second a dull beat against the steel walls. Richard lifted the device, his hand steady, his smile growing like a shadow. "Any last words, Ken?" he asked, like an executioner offering the illusion of choice. Ken took a deep breath, and in his eyes there was no fear, but a flame that had never gone out. He knew he could still turn fate around, even if it cost him his own blood. The silence fell heavier, as if the air had been sucked out of the vault. And it was in that instant, on the razor's edge between life and death, that the impossible choice materialized before him. The next move would decide not only who would survive, but what legacy would be written in the city's memory. The vault became a silent battlefield, where every breath was a snap of tension ready to snap. Richard took a step forward, raising the detonator with the cruel pleasure of someone who believed he had already won. Ken Griffin stood erect, his gaze fixed on his brother-in-law, as if each second were an eternity to be traversed. Victoria, between them, seemed ready to shatter, her body bent under the weight of divided loyalty. Ethan Cole, in the corner, was assessing routes, every muscle ready to spring, though the pain from his injury burned in his shoulder like a hot iron. The flashing red light of the fire alarm painted the scene with shades of blood, as if the environment itself foreshadowed the impending tragedy. Ken knew he had to risk everything right then. There was no time for speeches, only actions. He lunged forward, grabbing a heavy bronze bust on the pedestal beside it. With the strength of someone who fights not just for himself, but for hundreds of lives, he threw the piece at Richard. The impact on his brother-in-law's chest sounded like thunder, throwing him backward, the detonator flying from his hand. Victoria screamed, a sharp sound that tore through the safe as the dark object slid across the polished floor toward the doorway. Ken dove in, arms outstretched, heart pounding like a war drum. Sweat blinded his eyes, but his fingers touched the device an instant before it disappeared into the darkness. He held him tight, his body still sprawled on the ground, as Richard roared in despair. Everyone's future was now compressed in that closed fist, and the battle was just beginning. The crack of a gunshot shattered the air, the projectile ricocheting off the metal of the door. Victoria, wide-eyed, held the pistol that had previously seemed like just an accessory in her bag. His hands were shaking, but fury guided them, firing once more at his brother, missing by inches. Ken rolled behind a huge, cloth-covered room, his heart pounding in his ears, holding the detonator like a life shield. Richard, even stunned by the blow, stood up with hatred in his eyes, staggering like a wounded beast. He grabbed his wife's gun, wrenching it from her, and pointed it at Ken, his anger dripping with every word. "You have always treated us like leftovers, and now you will taste oblivion." The cold barrel glowed red, but before the shot could come, Ethan Cole lunged at Richard. The crash of their bodies echoed through the vault, both falling onto ancient boxes that shattered on impact. Pain stabbed through Ethan like a knife, but he still fought, his fists firm against the man trying to destroy everything. Ken emerged from the shelter, rushing to break up the scene, but Victoria, panting and confused, stood before him. Her eyes were watery, and in her voice there was desperation and pleading. "He's my husband, Ken. You don't understand." Ken stared at her, his gaze heavy with judgment. "I understand, Victoria. I understand that you chose the wrong side of history." She faltered, the arm raised in defense becoming as fragile as glass about to shatter. And in that moment, for the first time, he seemed to realize that there was no turning back. The flames of hatred and fear were devouring his soul, but the spark of doubt still flickered in his heart. Richard, with a roar of pain, pushed Ethan away with a brutal blow and aimed the pistol again. But instead of aiming at his brother-in-law, he pressed the barrel against Ethan's head, using him as a human shield. Ken froze, every muscle screaming to move forward, but the sight of his friend in danger forced him to hesitate. Richard smiled with the sadism of someone who finally believed he had control, his eyes glowing like embers of madness. "Now, Ken, hand over the detonator or watch the last ally you have die before you." Ethan, even under the cold pipe, looked up at Ken and, with a slight shake of his head, begged for silence. It was a courageous gesture, but also a request for the billionaire not to give in to the perverse game. Ken slowly raised his hand, the black device glowing faintly in the red light, each step heavy as lead. Victoria looked at the scene in shock, tears streaming down her face, as if only in that instant did she understand the depth of the abyss into which she had plunged. Ken stopped a few feet from his brother-in-law, sweat running down his face in rivers, and raised his voice in a glacial tone. "Do you want the detonator, Richard? Well, you'll only get it with my life." With a sharp click, he engaged the safety mechanism, and the device glowed with a pulsing red light. "It's armed," Ken said, his voice filled with firmness and sacrifice. "If I release this button, we all die." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Victoria's shaky breathing. And for the first time, Richard hesitated, the shadow of doubt creeping into his crazed conviction. The safe pulsed silently, each heartbeat amplified by the intermittent glow of the detonator in Ken Griffin's hand. Richard kept the gun pressed to Ethan Cole's head, but his gaze flickered between his brother and the device that could turn them both to dust. Victoria stood motionless, her eyes flooded with tears, as if she had awakened from a cruel trance from which she knew no escape. Ken breathed evenly, but inside him a hurricane raged, an immeasurable weight that crushed his soul. "You always wanted power, Richard. Now you have it. But power without honor is only ruin," he said, his voice cutting like steel. Richard gritted his teeth, sweat running down his temple, his arm trembling for the first time. He didn't expect his brother-in-law to be capable of sacrificing himself, of turning death into a weapon against him. Ethan, still trapped, felt the tension vibrate like a string about to snap. Victoria, between sobs, murmured, "Please stop. It doesn't have to end like this." But no one answered. The war left no room for supplications. Ken took another step forward, his thumb firmly on the detonator button. "If you take one more false step, Richard, not even the echo of your name will remain. Are you ready to die like this?" The silence that followed was thick as smoke, and for the first time, Richard looked away. The power he had always believed he possessed slipped through his fingers like cold sand. And in that brief instant, a crack opened in his blind determination, allowing ruin to approach. Victoria broke the silence with a scream, throwing herself against her husband in a desperate thrust. The collision was brutal, the shot echoing like thunder in the vault, the projectile ricocheting off the steel. Ken felt his heart freeze, but he saw that the shot had missed its target, cutting only empty air. Ethan seized the moment and, with a strength that seemed to come from his own pain, delivered a well-aimed kick to Richard. The impact threw him against a marble column, the weapon sliding from his hand like a defeated serpent. Victoria fell to her knees, sobbing, her fingers still reaching out toward her husband as if seeking to rescue something already lost. Richard, staggering, tried to get up, but blood was running down his temple, and his eyes no longer shone with fury, only with despair. Ken stepped forward, the detonator still firmly in place, and stared at the scene like a judge in an inevitable trial. Richard held out his hand in supplication, his voice hoarse. "I just wanted to be remembered." But the sound faded away, crushed by the sudden fall of his body against the ground, motionless, lifeless. Victoria let out a piercing scream, pain and regret mingling in a wail that pierced the steel walls. She hugged her husband's body, crying with the weight of someone who finally understood the price of her choices. Ken closed his eyes for a moment, the detonator still pulsing in his hand, a reminder of how close the abyss had been. Ethan, breathing heavily, leaned against the wall, his victory marked by blood and pain. But everyone knew that even though Richard was dead, the open wounds in that family would never completely heal. The vault doors burst open, and Marcus Chen entered, accompanied by armed men. The raised weapons slowly lowered before the scene, Richard fallen, Victoria in tears, Ken holding up the disarmed detonator. The silence was absolute, broken only by the incessant sobbing of the sister, who was no longer an accomplice, just a prisoner of her own ruin. Marcus gave Ken a firm look, who just shook his head, as if to say the battle was over. "It's over," Ken murmured, his voice hoarse but filled with a strength that is only reborn after passing through death. Victoria was pulled away in shock, her eyes wide, unable to comprehend that her name was now forever stained by the night at the museum. Ethan was held up, his face pale but still firm, his grateful gaze resting on Ken as a fellow soldier. Ken stood in the vault, motionless for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision, of life and death, a family turned into enemies. The detonator he held felt lighter now, as if its threat had evaporated with Richard's fall. But he knew that nothing would be easy from then on, for the legacy was marked by blood and betrayal. The museum walls, silent witnesses to the tragedy, would forever preserve the echo of the battle. Ken took a deep breath, trying to compose himself, but the bitter taste of victory followed him like a shadow. The Griffin Empire had survived, but at a cost no fortune could erase. And as the security team's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Ken sensed the real trial was yet to come, not in the hands of the law, but in the relentless memory of time, which never forgives choices made in darkness. The following days were shrouded in silence. as if the entire city had decided to forget the terror that had nearly engulfed it. The official version spoke of a foiled terrorist attack, obscuring the dark details of the family betrayal that nearly destroyed the Griffins. Richard Cross had been found guilty and killed in the attempt to detonate the explosives, while Victoria Griffin, broken inside, had been committed to a private psychiatric clinic. Nathan Griffin disappeared from the spotlight, buried in shame, and Marcus Chun remained steadfast in his loyalty, ensuring the truth never came to light. Ethan Cole, wounded, recovered in silence, refusing any reward, like a shadow that had fulfilled its mission and preferred to disappear. Ken Griffin, however, carried the weight of it all in silence. In his top-floor office, surrounded by glass that reflected the New York skyline, he watched the city he had nearly seen crumble. The lights shone like constellations, but to him each point reminded him of a life that had almost been lost that night. Dylan Brooks's note remained in a simple frame on the table, the 5 words scrawled by childlike hands more valuable than any contract. He touched the glass reverently, remembering the child's gaze, so pure and so brave. The legacy he had inherited from his grandfather was not just wealth or power. It was the courage to fight for what mattered, even in the face of loss and darkness. And it was in that silence that he understood. His life had changed forever. He was no longer just an heir or a billionaire. He was the guardian of a promise made in the heart of chaos. And that promise had a name: hope. Months later, on a cold autumn morning, the secretary announced an unexpected visitor. When Ken looked up, he saw Abigail Hayes standing in the doorway, with Dylan Brooks beside her, holding a worn teddy bear. The woman still bore the marks of the terrible night in her eyes, but now she walked firmly, protecting her son as if rebuilding her own dignity. Dylan, shyly, approached and held out the toy, the same one that had held the spy device. "Thank you for fixing my bear," he said, his voice clear and calm, without the tremor it had previously carried. Ken picked up the object carefully, and for a moment, he felt as if the weight of the world had become light. He smiled, not like a tycoon before an audience, but like a man facing a possible future. That simple gesture rekindled in him the faith that there was still innocence in the world, and that, no matter how much ambition had corrupted part of his family, the courage of one child had been enough to save them all. Abigail discreetly wiped away a tear, grateful not only for the protection, but for the restored dignity. And in that moment, Ken understood that his true legacy was not in the buildings he built or the numbers he accumulated. It was in the lives I chose to protect, in the good I could still sow. And it was alongside that mother and that boy that he decided to rebuild his story, no longer about empires, but about humanity. The morning sun reflected off the skyscraper's windows, painting the office with golden hues reminiscent of rebirth. Ken watched Dylan run through space, laughing as if the darkness had never existed, and felt that this was the truest victory of his life. Abigail silently thanked him again, but he shook his head, as if acknowledging that the debt could never be repaid. Because he wasn't the one who had saved the boy. It was the other way around. Dylan had saved him with 5 words that changed everything. The scars of betrayal still existed, deep and painful, but they had become reminders that life can be reborn even amidst ruins. Ken stood up and, for the first time in a long time, felt pride not in the billionaire everyone knew, but in the man the night at the museum had forged. He walked to the window, watching New York move hurriedly below, and smiled serenely. The world didn't need to know the whole truth, but it would never forget it. And as the cold wind blew against the glass, he heard his grandfather's firm voice in his memory. Courage is the most precious legacy a man can leave. Ken touched the framed note, closed his eyes, and made a silent promise to honor that legacy. Because in the end, it wasn't the name Griffin that needed to be remembered, but the courage of a child who dared to face the darkness. And with that, He knew that the future could still be written in light. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any moving stories. And, of course, leave a like, because it really helps the channel continue bringing inspiring stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.